I'm glad I ran across your channel. I really like listening to the stories that you tell. I like that they're not too long and tedious. It keeps them interesting. I have a short story for you about a time when I had a run-in with a Bigfoot. I was out in the woods with a young lady in my full-size 79 Ford Bronco. Oh man, I wonder if you still have that Bronco, Brian. I had a 78 Bronco. It was white. It was an OJ Bronco, and I loved that car, and I don't know why I sold it. But anyway, I'm glad we were in that vehicle, or we might have not gotten out of there. We were down in the woods doing what couples do in the woods at night when we heard a noise from something that was making sure we knew it was there. We never heard any hoops or hollers nor any tree knocks. It was just the god-awfulest breaking of limbs and trees I've ever heard in my life. It was loud and angry. It didn't just want us to know it was there, it wanted us to leave. I talked to a Bigfoot researcher who said it was mad, because at one point I got out and urinated, thereby marking its territory as mine. Well, maybe that's so. The researcher also said that this Bigfoot was probably a loner, and that's why we never heard any grunts or tree knocks. He didn't have any friends around to communicate with. Whatever it was telling us, we stopped doing what we were doing and we decided to get the heck out of there. My lady friend was so scared she curled herself up in a ball in the front seat and hugged her legs with her head down. I was scared, but I had to keep control and drive us out. I was checking the mirror and what little I could see in the brake lights for anything coming up behind us. We worked our way around a corner holding our breaths, expecting at any time to see something jump out at us or show itself. Then we hit a straightaway and I kicked it from third into fourth. But up ahead was a tree lying across the road. It wasn't so big that we couldn't get over it in my Bronco, but a smaller or less powerful vehicle probably wouldn't have made it. I made the split-second decision not to stop. I knew there was no way I was getting out of that truck and moving that tree by hand. We were moving so fast when we hit it, I didn't feel like much more than a bump in the road. We were so scared, we didn't feel it anyway. We headed straight for my buddy's house who lives down in that area. He and I had done a lot of exploring on our four-wheelers over those woods. The Bigfoot researcher told me that the Bigfoot probably knew my buddy because it followed us to his house that night. After that, he had several strange occurrences happen. One night he heard all kinds of bumps and growls outside like someone was throwing things at the house. One thing I don't understand, it was pretty clear that it wanted us to get out of there. But why did it block the road with a tree? Was it trying to push us further in the woods, or was it trying to hurt us? Or was it trying to catch us on the tree? If so, what did it want? This all happened off of Highway 221 in Forest City, North Carolina. If anyone has an answer for what it was trying to do, I'd sure like to know. Hey y'all, welcome to the podcast. My name's Cam Buckner. This is the Dixiecryptid podcast, also known as the What If It's True podcast, out on the internet. You can listen to the What If It's True podcast on any podcast app, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pandora, whatever you have on your phone or listening device. Do a search for What If It's True podcast, or you can type in Dixiecryptid. It'll all be there at the top. Right now, along with all the new podcasts that I put out, the original podcasts, I have almost 250 episodes on your podcast app to listen to older archive stories. If you're new to the channel or new to the podcast, you probably haven't heard these, and there's not a bad one in the bunch. So if you ever get bored and you just want to hear somebody just reading stories, good, engaging stories, open up your podcast app. Again, do a search for What If It's True podcast or Dixiecryptid. It'll be right at the top. You can listen until you get sick of me.
Just want to throw that out there. A lot of people complain about the ads on YouTube. You don't run into that on the podcast. There may be one or two. They're about a minute long, and that's it. Speaking of ads, I get all kind of comments about how many ads are in my YouTube videos. I can't do anything about that. There is a feature when I upload a video where I can place ads, but no matter what I do, YouTube puts as many ads in there as they want. Now listen, this is how YouTube makes money. I get it. That's how they pay me. I get a revenue share off of those ads. I never ask for money. I don't have a donation tab. I'm just not that way. I just do this podcast and let her rip. And I'm happy with what YouTube pays me. Regarding the ads, there's nothing I can do about it. So if you feel like leaving a comment about the ads, just don't, because just write a letter to YouTube. Tell them to quit putting so many ads in the videos. And there's another option. You can buy YouTube Premium. I just renewed my YouTube Premium subscription 2 months ago. It's $8 a month, give or take some change. It's the cheapest. Once you use it and you don't have any ads, you will gladly pay that $8 a month. That's cheaper than a pack of cigarettes, y'all. It's not much cheaper than a 6-pack of beer. So you can eliminate all those by subscribing for $8 a month to YouTube Premium. I suggest you look it up and look at what they say about it. Just go to your tab in YouTube and type in YouTube Premium. Everything you want to know will be right there. You can click a button, subscribe, put your credit card in, however they take payments, and it's $8 a month. It's really a good deal in my view. So anyway, I'm writing Steve Lilly. I wanted to put this archived podcast video out just to keep you guys busy while I'm deep into this writing thing. And that's all I'm going to say. 4 minutes of me yapping. Good grief. But this is a dozen stories. Some of them are long. This will be the only boring part of the whole video. So I hope you enjoy it. All right, here we go. I have a story I'd like to share. It happened years ago back when I was in high school. My friends and I would camp out in the woods in and around the neighborhood. Brad and Steve and I were heading out into the woods on a Friday. It was just about dark, so Brad ran ahead to get the fire started while Steve and I carried the cooler out to the site. As Steve and I headed down the path towards the site, we stopped for a second to put the cooler down. We both lit a cigarette and were chatting when all of a sudden I noticed it was eerily silent. No crickets chirping, no birds, nothing, just dead silence. The next thing I know, about 100 yards down the path, there was an almost 90-degree turn. Brad comes hauling around the corner, and as soon as we saw him, he started yelling, "Go, run, get out of here." Steve and I stood there waiting for Brad to get to us to see what was going on. Brad just kept screaming, "Run, go," as he blew right by us, heading back out of the woods. So me and Steve tossed our cigarettes, left the cooler there, and started running after Brad. Finally, when we got out of the woods, we caught up to Brad in a field that led to some other woods. You could see in Brad's face that he was spooked. I've never seen anybody that scared before in my life, and as long as I've known Brad, even still to this day, he doesn't scare easily, if at all. After we caught our breath, we asked Brad, "Dude, what was that all about? What happened?" He started saying, I saw something in the trees. You guys are going to think I'm lying, that I'm full of it. So after about a minute and a couple of drags off a cigarette, Brad says, "You guys have known me for a long time. Have I ever lied to you guys about anything?" "No," we said in unison. So Brad says, "When I got to the campsite, I started to grab some wood to get the fire going. And as I was picking up some wood, I got a real eerie feeling like something was watching me. I looked around and didn't see anything, and then as I reached down to pick up some sticks, I noticed that it was dead quiet, no sound at all. As I stood back up after picking the sticks up, I noticed movement up in a tree on my right, and when I looked up there, I saw something." "Well, what did you see?" we asked. "I don't know how to say this," said Brad, "or how to explain, other than to say I saw a predator like in the movie. Me and Steve started laughing, but something in the fear in Brad's face, or the fact that he doesn't lie, stopped us after a few seconds. So as Brad started to say, "I knew you guys wouldn't believe me," Steve looks back at him and says, "Brad, a predator? Come on." And Brad started to explain, "I didn't see an actual predator, but you know in that movie how it camouflages itself and it's like see-through? That's what I saw. It was up in the trees and I could see the distortion, was moving side to side, almost like swaying in the breeze." And then he said he saw it move over to another tree next to the one he spotted it on, and just dropped the sticks in his hands and took off running. So the three of us just stood there trying to decide what and if we were men enough to go back and get the cooler so we could go back to my house and party there. Brad waited in the field as Steve and I went back into the woods to grab the cooler with our heads on a swivel. Luckily, the cooler was only a couple of 100 yards into the woods and was visible from the field where the path started. Otherwise, that cooler would be staying there for the night. I've been in those woods 100 times since then and grew up in them prior to that night. Brad still to this day swears he saw what he said he saw, and I believe him.
I want to share my experience in Chetwynd in 1993. I worked for a forestry contractor based out of Prince George. We were working helicopter contracts being flown in daily for patching clear cuts that had failed their first effort to replant several years before. The first few days were without issue, and a few guys working the limit of the clear cut claimed to have seen some tracks in the mud. I saw a few, and they were way larger than my size 14 foot. The rumors started to make the rounds, and the guys who lived in the area, which is British Columbia, thought nothing of it, like it was normal to see these giant tracks. The guys who came from the east in Canada tended to be more skeptical, and they mocked the rest of us. But a few days later, we noticed that some of our tree planting shovels had gone missing. This went on day after day, and our boss was furious. Replacing lost shovels for workers when they are flown in by helicopter to inaccessible areas is a big frickin' deal. We didn't have access to a local hardware store. Our boss said, "Whoever's doing this better knock this shit off now. Not only will you lose your job, I'm going to turn my back and let the guys who are now unable to make money have their way with you." We were all terrified of being labeled as the thief, while simultaneously suspecting the guy we liked the least as the culprit. At any rate, the shovels kept disappearing, and soon vehicles were being vandalized. It quickly became apparent that none of us were doing this. The more the work slowed, the less money we made. All of us were angry to miss out on the income, every one of us. And still the shovels kept vanishing. At the base, the trucks were having large stones thrown at them and breaking out windows. Those were stones that we struggled to roll or lift, and the damage done to our trucks was like these stones were launched from a cannon. The damage was extensive. One truck that was new only 2 months prior was in fact written off or totaled. We didn't see anything, and we didn't hear anything, at least not there. But I also know that no one flew their own personal helicopter in each day to steal our $45 shovels, and each person on my crew stayed the whole season, so it didn't appear that there were any dissidents among us. I can't say it was a Sasquatch, but then I don't know of too many other possibilities. I don't know any animal that I've encountered in my 46 years in Canada that would steal shovels or launch a 50-pound stone at a vehicle. Whatever kind of being did this had dexterity, and it acted with intelligence and stealth, all the while maintaining a constant presence that 50-some-odd guys never detected. Was it a Sasquatch? I haven't seen one of these beings face to face, but I have lived alone in the woods, and at times, with a few others, off-grid for 5 years of my life in British Columbia, northern Manitoba, in central Ontario, hundreds of miles from the nearest towns. In addition to my Chetwynd experience, I have seen tracks and I've heard calls that I can't place, and I have viewed tree origami that just doesn't make sense given the general accepted catalog of North American animals. I don't want to take up more of your time. I just thought I'd share these things. If you ever had more questions, please email me. Dude, you're not taking up my time. This is what I do. He goes on to write, my wife and I are headed back to British Columbia to travel and camp and head up to the Yukon and Alaska next year, and I can't wait. My heart is in those woods. Given my occupation and work, I need to ask that my name not be revealed. I wish it were otherwise, but I know you have a keen interest in these things, and I wanted to share this with you. Well, that's his first experience, and that's quite fascinating. You know, a bunch of guys work in the timber industry, all of them have shovels, and all of a sudden these shovels just start vanishing. Why would anybody steal a shovel and take, they're just costing themselves money, and then the rocks being thrown through the trucks. But he has another story. This one is not Bigfoot related, but it is fascinating. As a matter of fact, it's way better, not better, but it's way more interesting to me than his first story. And I think you may agree with me. He writes, I'm taking some lunch right now and also taking a much needed break from some internal audits my company performs. And I'd like to share another experience I had. This one occurred just weeks before the initial experience I previously shared with you. It doesn't fall into a typical cryptids or UFO story, but it's actually more frightening for me because to this day, I don't know what happened, nor does the guy who was with me. My former brother-in-law, John, and I left Winnipeg early April of 1985 to head to British Columbia to work for the summer near Chetwynd. We decided that we would drive through the day and night on this 24-hour journey and take some stops along the way, even though it would make our trip more like 36 hours long. My 1984 VW Golf was packed to the roof. I'm sharing this because it will be pertinent later in the event. We left Lloydminster, Alberta at roughly 2:30 after an uneventful first day of driving. After driving all that day, we had both hit our second wind and drove rather than resting despite the late hour and having been on the road over 12 hours at that point. We were traveling west on Highway 16, which in Canada is known as the Yellowhead. In these parts, there are not a lot of people, and we would pass another car maybe every half hour at best. There's just not much doing in these parts during the day, and absolutely nothing at night. To keep ourselves going, we had the windows rolled down for the cool night air and had some of our favorite tunes playing on my stereo, and we smoked a few good cigars just to pass the time. I remember changing the song on the stereo and glancing at the time. It was 3:45, and we still had an hour and 45 minutes to Edmond, Alberta. What happened next I can only describe as if my life was like an old reel film that someone cut 7 hours of time out of and spliced it back together again. Because in a flash, 7 hours of time that we would not have otherwise known went missing except for that it was now clear daylight and we were not on the highway. 1 minute I was driving, and the next I was in the hatch of my car with my body pressed into the roof, laying on my back, upside down and looking backwards out the hatch with my face pressed against the glass. I called for John again and again to help me because I was stuck. I would later learn that he was upside down, his upper body in the footwell with his head wedged behind the center console. I kept calling to him to help me and open the hatch because there was no way that I could get out otherwise. I was pressed in there in a way that defied any logic. Eventually, John got to the back of the car and he helped me out. We were finally free, and both of us standing next to the car, and we gazed around confused for several minutes, and we only stared some wild-eyed glances at each other. I offered him a cigarette, and we sat in what we now realize was a field of mature wheat with no highway in sight. I glanced at the time, and it was 10:30 with the sun shining bright. Finally, after finishing a cigarette, I said, "I don't know what just happened, but I want you to take a piece of paper, and we're both going to write down what we can each recall since we left the most recent gas station in Lloydminster." After doing that, we compared notes and shared exactly the events that I just shared with you. We then looked around and saw a gravel road not too far away. The soil was bone dry, so I could make it out in my VW Golf, and in doing so, it dawned on me that we were ruining this old mature wheat as we drove out, but astonishingly had not made any visible path getting to this spot. And with this, I started to shake, and when John looked over at me and saw me shaking, he saw what I was seeing. The realization that we had been placed in this field was shocking. He started to cry, I suppose, out of fear, and then it sank in that we just lost 7 hours of our lives. It went from night to day and highway to a random field in the blink of an eye. I followed the gravel road and it led me back to Highway 16. And for a moment, I thought, okay, maybe I just went off the highway and passed out. Now this calmed me for a moment, and then I saw the road signs and I realized that we were now back east 15 kilometers or 9 miles from where we were last. To explain this more clearly, we were traveling in the same place we were driving the last 10 minutes before we went blank. Now we were more freaked out than ever, and I pulled over because my foot shook so much to drive a steady throttle, and I looked over the car. There was not a spot of damage to the car. We were not hurt or disturbed in any way that we could tell, other than our car was 9 miles backwards from where we left off in the middle of a wheat field with no tracks leading to where my car wound up. And then 7 hours of my life had vanished. When we arrived in Prince George at corporate headquarters, we checked into the medical clinic. I feared I had some mental episode or we had our drink spiked or something, but both John and I checked out okay. We passed the required toxicology screening for our employment. John and I have run into each other occasionally over the past 25 years, and we both recall the same details to this day. I have no idea what happened to me and John, and in being brave enough to share a few times with others, we have only faced ridicule. I'm not prepared to say that I was abducted by something, but I also know that what occurred was not just me falling asleep at the wheel. I really don't know what occurred that night 25 years ago. In later years, I would learn professionally that this world is not what we think we were raised to think it is. I look forward to the day that I can speak on that more clearly. Keep up the good work, Cameron. I really like your format where people can feel they have nothing they have to prove, and they can just share. We and they are not crazy, and society is programmed to make us feel scared of being labeled and mocked as such. You can't choose your neighbors. If you're moving to a new home, you can to a degree. While shopping for a new place, if you will pay attention to the area around the neighboring homes, you might know what sort of neighbors you'll have for the foreseeable future. Unkept property along with various other signs will clue you in to what life will be like in the neighborhood. However, after you buy the place and move in, you never know who's going to move in next door a year later. This is what happened to us after buying a home in a rural area with a few acres in Mississippi. In 2008, my wife and I wanted to get away from the city. The city we loved all our lives had turned violent. The politics, the violent crime, the traffic, and the devaluing of homes all over the county left us with no choice. So we began to look for a quiet place to live out our middle-aged years in peace. My wife was a bit apprehensive about moving away from good health care and family, but the desire to get to a peaceful place overrode all those concerns. We were in our early 50s. I was not retired, and my job allowed me to work from anywhere as long as the internet was available. We settled on an existing home on 5 acres of land. Our nearest neighbor was within eyesight, but the distance was such that we didn't feel like that they were close. The place next to us was well taken care of, and after meeting our neighbors, we knew we had chosen a good place to live. Within 6 months, however, that property went up for sale, and it sold quickly. Within a month of the for sale sign coming down, our new neighbors moved in. That weekend gave us a good idea of how life would be for us for the next 3 years. They threw a party in the backyard. Rap music blared all night. Cars were in and out until the early morning, and we didn't get much sleep, and our 2 dogs barked at the noise all night. The next day I rode my ATV over to meet these people and to let them know that my hope was that these parties would be few. My first trip over produced no interactions. I knew the hangovers would be bad for these people, and I gave them some time. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, there was life stirring around the house, so I went back over. And there's no need to describe the conversation that followed, but it was not pleasant. I was told that this was their property, and they would do whatever they wanted whenever they wanted, and that I needed to F off. I didn't need a confrontation, so I left, but it would have been my great pleasure to put this punk in the hospital for a few days. But I'm a grown man now, and I learned a while back to avoid these conflicts unless I have no choice. The new homeowner, or tenant, I would later discover, was a 20-something white male who had an affection for the urban gangland lifestyle, music, and wardrobe. It has amazed me that some of the younger generation want to appear as stupid-looking as possible. The fact that this kid was a redneck from a small town in Mississippi made him look even more ignorant. My guess is that if he had been transplanted immediately to an actual urban gangland environment, he would have folded in a second. I figured that he would soon find out that he was not as bad as he thought he was, because there was no doubt that he would soon be a convict at Parchman before he was 30. Inmates there have a way of sorting out the misfits. But that was none of my business. I just hoped that we would have no more trouble for them, and I will say now that we personally didn't. There were a few times over the following months when they deprived us of sleep, but it was not often, and the situation was bearable. Later, checking the records in the courthouse, it appeared the property was owned by his father, a wealthy North Mississippi businessman. I didn't know, and I didn't care who the actual property owner was. The records for the property was down the hall from the tax collector's office, so while buying tags for my car one day, I walked down and I looked them up. This has no relevance to this story other than to give you a feel for the kind of person that we were dealing with at the time. The new neighbors moved in during December, and by May, a new chain-link fence had been installed behind their house. 4 large pit bull dogs were now being kept inside the fence. The fence was tall, 6 feet tall, and we never worried that the dogs would escape. That was not the problem. By July, there were 15 or 20 pit bulls inside this fence. They were all staked to a short, heavy chain with no shelter. The dogs appeared healthy. I saw the tenant feeding and watering the dogs each morning, but it was hot that summer and those dogs roasted in the sun during the hot months. My wife and I love dogs. We have 2. One is actually a pit bull rescue. He's a big teddy bear, and we take great care of our dogs. But my neighbor, on the other hand, looked to be training these dogs for something else. On the other side of their place, a privacy fence went up. It was not a large area, and at first I thought they built it to conceal the trash cans. I noticed my neighbor and two other men taking two dogs into that fenced area, and soon I could hear dogs fighting. The men would be screaming at the dogs, provoking them to attack each other. I never saw it happen, but it was obvious what they were doing. And then during the fall, I would see the tenant was out among the 15 or 20 chained dogs. He would pick a few of them out and beat them with a limber stick until they became aggressive with him. Some would cower in fear, and those were taken to his car and removed. I suppose they were given away or just dropped out somewhere. I thought he just got a kick out of being cruel to animals, but a friend visiting me one day told me that the guy was raising fighting dogs and he was probably selling them. Allow me to stop here and qualify that at that time there were no laws in this county that made anything he was doing illegal. I once saw the sheriff at a local restaurant and I asked him about it. He straight up said there was nothing he could do and suggested that I contact one of the national groups that handle these things. I did that and I never heard from the organization again. In addition, those were his dogs, they weren't mine. It was not my place to tell him what to do with his property. If there was something I could have done, I would have done it. There were 2 instances where dogs escaped and they found their way to the back of my house. I armed myself and approached them slowly, only to find that these dogs were just happy to have some gentle human reaction. They were not well-mannered, meaning that they jumped all over my wife and I, and one got pretty rough with me, but at no time did they seem aggressive. Both of those dogs were taken to a shelter many miles away in another state. I never returned them to the owner. Maybe that is the best I could do, and I hoped more would escape and make their way to my house, but none ever did. And since that time frame, the city and county have passed animal cruelty ordinances, and officials strictly enforce them. Dogs on chains are forbidden inside the city limits, and in the county, the dogs must be well cared for with shelter, water, and food. The owners get one warning. After that, the dogs are removed and taken to an adoption service. And I'm pleased that my county now sees that these animals need protection. Now to the topic of Bigfoot. I have known that Bigfoot exists since I was a child. My grandfather showed them to me in Arkansas on his land years ago. But that is an entirely different story. As a child and a teenager, my grandfather showed me how to draw the creatures near to me. It takes a lot of time. So when we moved to the country, my first thought was to see how many, if any, Bigfoot inhabited the forests around us. With the steps I took, gifting and leaving subtle signs behind our home, finally I confirmed that a clan did indeed live in our woods. We never saw them, but we knew they were there. They let us know they were there in no uncertain terms. I know your stories are about Bigfoot, and in the stories you share, we get to hear about all the typical behaviors that Bigfoot exhibits. But I will leave that out of the story. My goal here is to tell you how Bigfoot handles cruel animal owners. However, I will mention that it is my experience that the big alpha males, or the fathers of the clans, usually stay in the background. They do not reveal themselves unless they need to as a show of dominance to other animals. We never saw signs of a huge alpha, but we knew he was there lurking in the shadows, watching everything his clan did. The stories you hear over and over regarding children and animals being saved from critical situations, that is typically the result of a female Bigfoot intervening in the natural course of things. Males generally never do this, and it is my opinion that the patriarchal males probably disapprove of the female's intervention into human activities. But it happens anyway. I believe that a female, seeing a dire situation, will pull on the britches in the family and take matters into her own hands no matter what the male thinks. Back on the farm, the dog training and whipping seemed to get more serious as the fall months set in. The temperatures were cooling down, and by Thanksgiving it was chilly. My neighbor had begun doing his beating and training at night. They had installed 2 lights on each side of their fighting pen. I suppose this was to conceal what they were doing from neighbors like me. Maybe they just enjoyed the cooler nights, I don't know. Whatever the reason, the training intensified. On moonlit nights, I would go to the edge of my property after hearing noises from the creatures in the woods. It was a regular thing I did. When I knew the Bigfoot were close, I would sit in the yard close to the trees and just talk to them. Even though my wife believed in these creatures, she still thought that I was nuts for doing this, but I knew they were there. On some nights, there would be 3, maybe 4 creatures just beyond the light of my house. I could see movement and trees moving, and I could hear them breathing, especially when I would pitch a half a pone of cornbread into the woods or other table scraps that we didn't eat that night. I just knew they were there, and I felt like the last year had been productive in developing a relationship with our clan. In addition, I always knew when the creatures were behind my neighbor's house. The distance from my back porch was a long way, but I could clearly see the dogs in the moonlight. Every dog chained to the ground would get up and stretch that chain to the limit looking into those woods. Every tail would be wagging and all barking would instantly stop. By this time, there were between 20 and 30 dogs inside that fence. I wish you could have seen it because it would have given you great joy seeing those happy tails wagging. Now, I think I know what they were looking at. The creatures knew what was going on at that house, and it is my feeling that even though they did not like it, that Big Alpha forbid his clan from intervening. This went on for several weeks, and the tenants' training method grew more violent. The beatings became even more frequent. On a chilly night in March, I was awakened by a gunshot. It was not unusual for neighbors all around the area to shoot guns on their property, but I had never heard a gunshot at 2 in the morning. I got out of bed and I dressed quickly and was soon out on our back porch under the canopy. Rain fell in a steady shower. I tightened up the collar around my neck and I walked towards my neighbor's house. The whole backyard was lit up by lights attached to the house. He had a dog by the chain and was beating it unmercifully. I could hear the yelps and the squeals from the poor animal. The closer I got, the more clear the scene became visible in the misty conditions. He had a pistol in his hand, and he would shoot it in the air on occasion. It didn't make sense to me. I think he wanted to shoot those dogs, but he thought better and he would shoot a round off in the air. Then he would go to another dog and start the process all over again. I had had it with this guy, and against my best judgment, I yelled to him to knock this crap off and leave the dogs alone. It was not the smartest move that I ever made. He did have a firearm and was probably under the influence of who knows what. He heard me, but he kept beating the dog he had in his hand until it began to fight back, at which point he released the dog and he moved to another. I yelled at him again, and this time he heard me and came to the fence, and he yelled something back that I did not understand, and then he went back inside. I returned home, I dried off, and I discussed the event with my wife. She wanted to do something, but still there was nothing we could do. If we stole the dogs or released them while he was away, we would be the criminals. That's what we wanted to do. It was frustrating for both of us. The nightly beatings continued. On a comfortable night in May, I sat on my back porch and I watched him head out to the large pen with his stick and open the gate. It was a few minutes past 11 p.m. I knew his pattern. He always started with the dogs closest to the gate, but for some reason we will never know, he went to the back of the enclosure, and I suppose he was planning to work his way forward. Every dog cowered and laid flat to the ground as he walked through the area. There was no barking and no excitement. There was not a sound. They knew he was coming. He made it to the back of the enclosure, and instead of starting on the dogs, he leaned his back against the chain-link fence and lit a cigarette. I remember seeing the orange glow on his face when he would take a long draw. I just watched him. He was bouncing against the fence, leaning back into the give of the chain link and letting it push him forward. Over and over, he used the fence as a lateral trampoline, bouncing a bit harder each time until I could hear the fence creaking. He was letting the dogs feel his anger and getting them afraid of him even more. He thumped the cigarette butt at the closest dog, and I saw sparks settle on the animal, burning its hide while it moved to relieve the pain. There was a short yelp. He bounced himself off the fence one last time and leaned forward to commence this night's beating. But before he could take the first step, a massive black arm reached over the fence, and the last thing I saw was his legs being dragged over the top of the 6-foot-high top rail. No scream, no noise at all. He just vanished into the woods. I stood there for a minute in shock. What should I do? Should I call the police? Should I go knock on their door to see if anyone was home? I had never seen anyone living there, even though he did have visitors all the time. I reached for my cell phone and was about to dial 911, and I stopped. When the officers showed up, what was I going to tell them? A family of Bigfoot took him? Hell, they would put me in jail and probably consider me a suspect. I put the phone in my pocket and I walked inside. My wife was already in bed. I undressed and crawled in beside her, kissed her neck, and I went to sleep. It was a good night's sleep at that. The next day, I saw that nothing had changed at his house. The dogs were still there, the overgrown grass still annoyed me, and I wonder if I had dreamed all of this. I decided that I had been fully awake when it all happened, so I relaxed, I ate breakfast, and I started on a project that I had been planning to do for months. I was going to plant fast-growing trees at the edge of my property adjacent to his house so that I wouldn't have to look at the meanness after the trees grew large enough, however long that took. I finished late in the day, and soon it was dark. No one had showed up at that house. No one knew he was gone. I did see one car pull in the drive that night, but they turned around and left after seeing the tenant was not home. It was the 4th day after the incident that things began to happen. That morning, sometime before lunch, I saw 2 sheriff's cars in the driveway from my office window. I saved my work and I leaned out and watched. 2 deputies walked around the house several times and then stood by their cars. Soon, a civilian drove up. I assumed it was the father, and the deputies talked to him for a while and they all went inside the house. Not long after, there was a knock on my front door, and when I answered, one of the officers stood there with a pad and a pen. He asked me the usual questions, and I told them the last time I saw the tenant, he was in the backyard 3 nights ago beating his dogs, and that I paid no attention and that I went to bed. I had not seen him since. The officer seemed perplexed about the dog beating statement and asked about that further. I explained what I had seen the man do for the last few months and that I had told the sheriff about it. It seemed to ring a bell with the deputy, and he mumbled something about wishing they had the authority to stop the animal abuse in our area. I actually believed him. He asked if I had seen any activity at the house since, to which I replied no, but that I had not really been paying attention, and that was the truth. I then asked the deputy if I could go over and feed the dogs. If this guy had been missing for 3 days, I was sure the dogs were starving. He agreed that that was a good idea, and I headed over. I made my way into the garage to find the dog feed, and I saw several large bags in a utility room. Rats had chewed holes in all the bags, and I didn't know how old the dog food was, but it would be something for the animals until something got figured out. I found a 2.5-gallon bucket, I filled it with feed, and I walked into the fence. None of the dogs were aggressive with me. Some cowered away, but that was to be expected. Most were happy to see me. A few trips later, and I had all 24 dogs fed and watered. As I walked through the garage to leave, I heard the father saying something about drug deals and gangs, etc. I didn't catch enough to know what they were talking about, but I thought to myself, if they get on that trail, they wouldn't even investigate around the house. Maybe that would keep them out of the woods and away from the Bigfoot clan. That is exactly what happened. In the news, I read that the man had been tied to a local drug distribution ring and had been under surveillance by local authorities. I didn't have any idea he was under surveillance while I lived there, and of course that he was missing, and if anyone had any information to please call the number below. To my knowledge, no one ever called that number with anything of value to the investigation. Almost a year later, I was walking through the woods behind our house. I was looking for signs of the Bigfoot clan. I had not seen or heard from them since the night Tupac disappeared. I walked through the thick patch of briars, a place I had never explored, and I saw something that didn't belong. I approached the object and I saw a white Nike running shoe. It was dirty now, and it looked as if it had not been moved since it fell there. Small new plants grew through the laces, which were still tied. I saw nothing else of interest, and so I walked back out the way that I had come in. We sold that property a while back, and I have moved to another larger town in a neighboring state. I am retired now and enjoying my days with my wife. Oh yes, about the dogs. I worked with our local rescue organization, and every dog, all 24, were eventually adopted out to families far away from Mississippi. Some actually live in Manhattan in New York City. One even lives with us now. She's an old dog now and short on time, but she's very comfortable. We gave her a good life after that ordeal. Believe me, she earned it. It was 6 years before I began to see evidence that the Bigfoot were back. Maybe it was the same clan, maybe it was a new clan. Maybe they never left and just kept a very low profile around my house. I will never know. I never stopped occasionally leaving them gifts through the years, but most of the time when I would come check back the next day, the gifts were still there unless it was food. But even then, any animal could have taken that food. During the last years that we lived there, I knew the young ones and the females were close. They were always present when I had the dogs out in the back playing with them. I think they like that kind of thing. Something happened to me that has always haunted me. I've never told anyone except my father and my best friend. Neither one of them believed me. During the 1970s and 80s, my dad was a land developer in East Texas around Toledo Bend and Sam Rayburn Reservoir. He would buy lakeside lots of land and get a surveyor to break it down, and then he'd put in roads and he'd sell the lots. He developed several campgrounds and neighborhoods that way, and I grew up in a small town in deep East Texas around the Sabine and Angelina National Forest above the Big Thicket. Every now and then, Dad would go see the surveyor to discuss the business, and sometimes he would take me with him. I thought I would enjoy the ride, and the surveyor had a son that I could play with. His name was Tommy James, and we called him TJ for short. He was 9, and I was 11. He didn't go to my school, but he was fun to play with because he was a simple kind of country kid. And we would shoot BB guns and we'd whittle sticks and get dirty playing in the dirt pile with his Tonka trucks. It was while we were playing in a dirt pile one day when TJ slowly looked up at me and he said, "There's a Chewbacca man that lives down that trail right there." He pointed to a thin trail in the back left corner of his backyard. "You want to go see it?" he asked. "Chewbacca lives back there?" I asked. "Yep, he's a Chewbacca man," TJ assured me. I remember laughing and saying, "Okay, let's go see Chewbacca Man." We started down the little path with me convinced that we were playing make-believe, and I was surprised how far TJ was taking me. It seemed like we walked for a long time before we came to a huge deadfall across the trail, and it looked like a tree had fallen down and taken a lot of trees with it. There were empty Cracker Jack boxes with Little Debbie snack cake wrappers strewn on the ground in front of it, and I guess this is where TJ came to eat his snacks. TJ looked around and he said, "Well, this is it. I'll call him." He let out a long howl. I was still convinced that this was just a game that we were playing, so I didn't expect to see anything. I figured this was his imagination in overdrive. But when he let out another long howl, I began to hear the sound of walking and cracking that was coming in our direction. "TJ, what is that?" I asked as the fog of make-believe was beginning to clear. "Well, it's the Chewbacca Man," he told me. I took a step back as TJ faced the deadfall and then began to speak in a coaxing tone. Come on. He was beckoning it like a little puppy. The walking sound stopped on the other side of the tree, and I could hear loud breathing like a horse. A horse, yes, I thought. He's calling a horse. I took a huge breath and I released it in a deep sigh of relief. TJ began to almost sing the word, "Chewbacca," in a gentle voice. He was calling it again. A few limbs shifted and moved in the deadfall, and then I heard it utter a single deep but faint word. "Oh." All of my former relief slipped away. In this place was a hard knot of fear and anxiety that the thought of whatever was on the other side of those trees that was big enough to have a voice that deep. I could almost feel its mass as it stood there breathing the air into its lungs that must have been massive. "Come on," TJ sweetly beckoned again. "Tommy," I whispered, "let's get out of here." At that second, the thing released a loud sound, and it shook the world around me, and it shot through me, and it rattled in my chest, and it left me stunned in my tracks. My eyes widened in fear, and my own lungs ceased to function. TJ was still calling the thing. I felt hot and sick, and beads of sweat broke out all over my body while my heart was jumping up into my throat. If I could have made my legs work, I would have run away. In my mind, this wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening, but TJ wasn't afraid. Limbs in the deadfall began to move and snap again, and I thought the thing was coming over it or through it, and big grunts of breath mingled with the sounds of limbs slamming and cracking. I was still frozen and could only stand there and listen to the thing raising hell a few feet away. TJ turned to me and he said, "He doesn't like you." As he spoke, I saw arms coming up over the deadfall. I didn't want to see more. "Tommy, run!" I screamed. "No, wait, it's okay," he was calling to me. I had already taken off, and I left TJ standing in the path, but that thing with the long arms and the deep growling voice and the loud scream was chasing me. I could hear it coming up the path behind me. It was exhaling great puffs of air with intense force. I barely felt the limbs slapping my face as I raced up the narrow path. I had to get to my dad. Behind me, that thing seemed to have left the trail altogether. All around me, branches were snapping and trees were cracking, and then it was in the woods next to me. And from the sound of the brush, I could tell it was running a wide circle, and I guessed it was about 25 feet out. Glimpses of its enormous black body with long arms swinging flashed through the leaves. It was so big and unbelievably fast. It was pulling ahead of me, but the trail was endless, and panic-stricken tears began to blur my vision when I realized it was going to cut me off. And ahead of me, I could see into TJ's backyard. "Daddy!" I screamed, "Daddy!" And then as I broke through the underbrush into the yard, that thing came to a sudden violent stop, and everything went silent. The thrashing of the limbs stopped, and the sounds of its breathing stopped, and the sounds of those impossibly fast footfalls stopped too. It had chased me all the way back up the trail, and it almost caught me. I ran into the office building where my dad and the surveyor were talking, and TJ came running up behind me. Well, I was out of breath, and I was crying and whimpering as I began to tell my dad about the big thing that was chasing me. TJ stood behind me, and he never said anything. Well, our neighbor has goats that get out all the time, the surveyor offered. I'll bet one of those nannies got out and got after you. Well, Dad could see that I was really scared, and he laughed and he patted me on the head and he told me to go wait in the truck. Well, I ran to the truck and I got in and I locked all the doors. I watched TJ walk slowly over to the truck and I waited until he was standing beside it before I had the nerve to roll down the window. I told you there was a Chewbacca man, he said. I saw it, I said. What was that thing? He's the boogeyman. He's a Chewbacca man, was TJ's only answer. Dad came out to the truck and I rolled up my window as he got in. And we were pulling away and I looked back to see TJ walking toward the back of the house. He turned around and gave me one last look before disappearing around the corner. Are you okay? Dad asked. You got chased by a goat, huh? No, Dad, it was not a goat, I answered. And I told him the whole story on the way home, but I could tell that he didn't believe me. He thought maybe a cow or a bull had chased me out of the woods. Well, months later, Dad asked me if I wanted to go to the surveyor's house with him again, and I gave him a solid no. Okay, I just thought I'd ask, he said, holding up his hands in surrender. He knew how I felt about that place. I never went back there again. Many nights I've laid in my bed and I've thought about what happened to me that day. I thought about TJ and all those wrappers around the trees. I figured he must have been going down there and feeding that thing. I guess he had kind of made a friend of it. I've also thought about what would have happened if I hadn't run. Sometime after that incident, I overheard my dad telling my mom that the surveyor had taken his family and moved out of the state. A neighbor down the road said that they had moved back to where his wife was from. It was Alabama or Mississippi, he couldn't remember which. It's funny, Dad said, that he didn't tell me he was leaving. He just up and left. And I got him a lot of business. He didn't even call to say goodbye. My father was disappointed. My father died several years ago without us ever talking about the incident again, but I think I know what made them move without warning. TJ called it the Chewbacca man. This is a story I heard a few years ago. It would be a crime not to let your audience hear this. The story takes place in the 1980s in the state of Utah and is about two young boys who had the shock of their lives when they came face to face with something that most people claim doesn't exist. A mining company needed 2 workers to clean out a mine located on a mountainside in a remote area in Utah. As luck would have it, they found 2 college students from Washington State who were interested in the job. One of the boys was 19 and the other was 21. And strangely enough, they were both Bigfoot enthusiasts and were no strangers to being alone in the woods. They arrived at the mine and set up their campsite. It was a very organized campsite, and these lads were to remove debris from this mine with buckets. A few days passed, and then early one morning, one of the mine owners was awoken to the ring of his phone. It was his partner. The boys had called him from a phone booth in town. Apparently, they had wrecked their car coming down the mountainside. Baffled by the news, the 2 men met and then drove to the town through pouring rain. While driving, the man who took the call said the boys claimed to have been chased off the mountain by a Sasquatch. They both laughed it off, thinking these kids just wanted out of the job and needed help after wrecking their car. Had they not wrecked, the owners probably would have never heard from them again. This is what they thought, but they would soon discover the truth. Finally making it to town, with the rain increasing throughout the drive, they found the phone booth where the boys asked them to meet. They expected to find the boys in a nearby cafe or place of business, and they never actually looked at the phone booth until one of the young men yelled for them. They looked over, and inside the booth were two college-aged men huddled together, wearing nothing but their boxer shorts. They ushered the kids into the truck where it was warm and then drove a block to the first cafe they saw. Once inside, the waitress brought them towels and blankets, and soon they were dry and warming up. And with some food finally in their stomachs, the two employees told this story. The young men had taken the job so that they could be in an area with reported Bigfoot activity. Their plan was to do their work and spend their off time searching for the creature. While doing research in Washington State, they had captured vocalizations, Bigfoot screams and howls, and had brought the recordings along with them to play on a loudspeaker. After finishing their work the evening before, they set up the loudspeaker and began playing the sounds. And something roared at them from a distance away. They turned the speaker off, and then they discussed it, and they ultimately agreed that the roar they heard was a bear. So they restarted blasting the sounds into the woods. Well, whatever had roared before began roaring again, and this time it was closer, and it was a continuous series of sounds. Now they knew they had attracted a Sasquatch, and there was no doubt, and they were excited. They admitted that they should have left the area at that point, but in their minds, this was the coolest thing to happen since their Bigfoot investigations had begun. So they cranked up the volume and let the recording play. The roars got louder, and they could now hear this thing coming toward them. Branches were cracking as it moved closer, and they could actually hear the footfalls of the creature. Now, not wanting to overdo it, they cut the feed to the speaker and moved into their tent, where they apparently thought it was safe, and then began making vocalizations with their own voices. I think we can all agree that these young men had a screw loose. Maybe they were just overconfident that they were safe. That was about to change, though. The tent was quickly jerked upward, lifting both men into the air until the floor of the tent ripped out, sending them a few feet to the ground. In an instant, they were sandwiched between two enormous, smelly creatures. The only conclusion would be obvious that the creatures had no interest in harming these young men because they turned their attention to the camp and began tearing everything to pieces. With the raging creature's attention elsewhere, the young men saw their chance to escape. In only their underwear, they sprinted to the car and took off down the mountain. At some point in their escape, they hit a tree, which made the car useless. And from there, they walked into town through the freezing rain. But still, their employers weren't sure if they believed the story. One suggested they get the young men into some clothes and then go to their campsite to salvage what they could. Both of the students shook their heads and emphatically stated that they were never going on that mountain again. And as a matter of fact, they were clear about getting home as soon as they could, even if they had to walk back to Washington State in the freezing rain wearing only their boxers. The owner of the cafe had joined the group. He told all the men that he would get the young men outfitted in new clothes and help them find a way home. The two owners of the mine, however, were curious about the story and they wanted to visit the camp. If this story were true, there would be evidence to back the story up. So up the mountain they drove in the rain. By the time they reached the campsite, the rain had stopped. And on the way up the old mining road, they stopped to inspect the car the men had abandoned. It looked like they had hit every tree and rock on their way down. The damage they saw was not from the impact where the car now sat. They had hit everything. It was in a place from which it could be easily towed. Whether the car was worth salvaging would be up to the body shop and the insurance adjuster, assuming these kids had insurance. Now at the campsite, the owner stood at a distance taking in the destruction. It looked nothing like a campsite. It was more like a corner of a landfill. Debris was scattered about and nothing looked like its previous form. A cast iron stove that was once inside the tent was now broken into pieces, and pieces of cast littered the area. Coolers had been crushed and tents and sleeping bags shredded. Even suitcases were ripped open and the boys' clothes didn't survive. Every garment was torn apart. Everything that once made up the organized campsite was now destroyed. Even the soda cans were crushed flat. Every single can. One of the owners bent over and picked up a piece of a toothbrush. Neither man had spoken since they arrived. And finally, one broke the silence. You believe this Sasquatch story? Well, I didn't until I saw this. I think we need to sell this claim and cut our losses, said the other. Well, you read my mind. Let's get off this mountain. The mine owners left the mountain and then made certain the college students had a way back to Washington. And after thanking the cafe owner, they left, and they never returned to their claim. I was born into a violent family. My father was an alcoholic Scot with a Native American in his lineage somewhere. My mother was an auburn-haired Irish girl who was naive but quick-tempered. Every day of my life was filled with arguments that turned violent. I became a panic-stricken, socially backward, messed-up kid, or as the kids at school called me, a retarded pansy. We lived in the Quad Cities area of North Alabama, a mile from the Tennessee River. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, owned the forested area. Those woods and the river were my sanctuary. I knew all the game trails, snake pits, and fishing holes for miles around, and I used to walk past the school bus stop and straight into the woods where I would spend my day in peace. At school, I was bullied and made fun of because I was a nervous and shy kid. Now I realized that I was suffering from severe social anxiety and panic attacks, a condition that was not studied in those days. I grew older and eventually collapsed into agoraphobia and became housebound. I only ventured out in the early morning hours to drive a newspaper route. This job allowed me to pay my bills but still be alone and isolated. It's difficult to describe the misery suffered by a housebound person, to be young and healthy yet afraid to walk out the door. In my mind, there was a monster just outside that door waiting to devour me. I thought I was insane, and that scared me even more. For years, I stayed inside, burying myself in pity because I couldn't live a normal life. I became jealous of others who were living the life I wanted, and that jealousy turned to resentment and eventually to pure hatred. I lived with my hatred and plotted my revenge. The insults and bullying never left my mind. Fantasies of punishing my tormentors began to consume me. The thoughts grew darker by the day. The torture methods I envisioned for my victims were only complete when at the last moment, before I killed them, I would reveal myself. I wanted them to see my face and regret the way they treated me. But insane or not, I never hurt anyone, even though the thoughts of revenge continued. And I wondered if this was the way serial killers got their start. When would I snap? Something strange was happening, though. The more of a monster I became in my own mind, the less I feared the monster beyond my door, and I began to venture out. Like in most neighborhoods, there are always the troublemakers, kids who seem to always cause problems. If it's a bad thing to do, when it would be easier to do good, they always choose the bad. They get a kick out of picking on kids who just want to have fun. They seek out the innocent and prey on them. Most kids grow out of that phase. Adulthood has a way of taming the devil inside us, but some never learn, and you have to wonder if they were born to constantly be a burden on society. Seth was the worst in our neighborhood. He spent his days tormenting the younger, weaker kids. I was his special project, and even as an adult, he once drove by my house shouting insults while flipping me the bird. Seth had been on my list for years. Seth seemed to idolize all the hoods around our town. Eventually, he teamed up with another local punk who had a worse reputation. Tony was a criminal who had done time in prison. When he was released, he showed no rehabilitation and resumed the life he lived previously. Robbery, burglary, and intimidation were his forte. Tony and Seth were arrested not long after for crimes that would send Seth to trial on a rape charge and Tony to death for murder. Tony was later convicted and his death sentence was carried out. In January of 1984, they both sat in the county jail waiting to be transferred to a federal facility where they would be held until their trial. Careless guards left Seth's cell unlocked and he slipped out without them noticing he was gone for several hours. The story was soon breaking news on the TV. He was believed to be armed and considered dangerous. No one was to try to apprehend him without calling the police, and authorities didn't know where he was, but they were searching local woods. The image of Seth's mugshot covering the screen brought back the hate that had built inside me. I remembered seeing Seth and his buddies in years past in the woods where I went for peace and quiet. I knew he would run to anything familiar, and sure enough, not long after the story broke the news, police cars were running down my road. They were looking for him in that place I call sanctuary, but I also knew that he would need shelter. It was cold, and it had been snowing, and Seth wouldn't stay in the open if he could help it. I knew exactly where he would be. It would be several hours before I needed to begin my paper route. I had plenty of time. With my pistol, a knife, and a flashlight, I headed for the woods. More cars drove fast down the road as I climbed the hill behind my house. They were heading to the wrong place. Seth would have made it past those woods by now, so I picked a route that would take me away from the search area through the woods and to the place that I would go if I were on the run. I was going to find Seth and I was going to kill him. He had it coming. The snow had stopped and the clouds began to clear. The full moon lit my way, although I didn't need it. I hadn't been in those woods for years, since the agoraphobia took over my life, but I knew the woods better than my own house. I was headed to the river. Years before, the TVA had piled large concrete pipes or culverts on the bank. They had never been used in construction, and I played in and around those pipes for years. It would be the only shelter for miles on this cold night. I would quietly slip down the bank and approach the massive pipes from that direction. He would never think of anyone coming from the direction of the river. He would be looking toward the woods. After making it to the river 100 yards from the pipes, I creeped along the bank. I wasn't afraid, and that felt good to me. I was outside in the open air. The monster I had feared was outside my door, had not attacked. I was free, and I felt like a kid again. The pipes came into view under the moonlight, and I stopped and watched for movement. Seth would be no problem physically. I could take him down quickly. I even hoped that he had a gun, so after I killed him, I could claim self-defense. And still, no monster came after me. Now, I was the monster. All was quiet except the shallow waves slapping the bank, and since there was no movement, I began to think Seth had not come here. Disappointment took over, and I walked the last few feet toward the opening of the large pipe. When I entered, an odor of urine and rotting fish hit me like a slap in the face. I stepped back out and took an inventory of the items around me. There were smaller pipes laying randomly along the bank, some piled up on top of each other and others I could see farther away from the water. With my pistol in hand and the flashlight on, I lit the interior of the pipe. I expected to see Seth right away. Instead, I got that strong smell again. I crept forward to exit at the other end and searched the pipes beyond, and I felt the presence of someone else there. It was like a sixth sense. Even though I could not see them, I knew they were close. And I felt it before I heard it. A warm wind came down the pipe into my face, and my chest began to vibrate slightly. No one was in the pipe with me. I could see the end, but thick brush had grown up at the far side opening. The air I felt was a breath or an exhale from something. I could smell it, and I stopped. It screamed so loud and was amplified inside the concrete tunnel. Stunned and frozen, I shined the light straight ahead and I saw two glowing red eyes staring back at me, and they were wrapped in the silhouette of a giant creature crouching behind the brush. I fired 2 shots at it, and then it stood up. The top of the 6-foot pipe was at its chest level. This thing was huge. With one swift motion, he was on top of the pipe, moving to the other end. It dropped down and glared at me, and I shot twice more, hitting it with both. And the creature flinched and then roared. I had to get to the other end into a smaller pipe where he couldn't reach me. Not sure I could get there fast enough, I sprinted anyway. After crashing through the tangle of vines and bushes, I was looking straight into a much smaller pipe where I would fit, but the creature wouldn't. Over the rocks and weeds, I dove into the end and crawled. Its hand brushed my shoe as it reached inside to catch me. I was inside far enough. The tube was too small for me to turn around and face the beast. The end in front of me was 10 feet away and completely blocked by debris, and I was trapped. So I waited periodically, trying to look over my shoulder at the thing after me, but it was pointless. Everything went quiet, and I couldn't hear it now. No footsteps crunching in the rocks, no heavy breaths, no screams. And for a second, I thought it had given up and left, until the whole pipe was lifted into the air. He was turning it on its end and trying to shake me out. And when he lifted the end, the pipe cracked, giving me a handhold. I could feel myself in the pipe being lifted vertically and lowered several times. I could hear the beast's frustration when I didn't pop out the end, but I hung on for my life. Maybe out of frustration, or maybe from lack of interest, it finally pushed the end over, and the pipe slammed onto another with a crash. I was on my back now, feet toward the ground at an angle and still unreachable from either end. And then one last lift dashed my hopes of surviving the night as it lifted the pipe, I suppose over its head, and threw 1,000 pounds of concrete and terrified human. My body tensed for the impact, and I expected the brittle cover to break apart enough for it to reach inside and pull me out, but it hadn't thrown me to the ground. The pipe and I sailed several feet in the air into the river. The cold water rushed in and shocked me, and if I crawled forward, I would be heading to the riverbed. Backing out of that broken pipe was difficult. My coat was hung on the reinforcing wire fabric, and it dug into my clothes, through into my flesh, but I pushed through it. My air was running out fast. My feet cleared the end of the pipe, and I only had a few more feet to go, and I would be free. One last push backward folded my coat over my head, so I allowed my body to relax enough to slip out of the heavy jacket. Without the coat, I was smaller and I pushed free from the pipe. The river was shallow in this spot, and one easy push off the pipe upwards sent me to the surface. My eyes searched the bank for the creature. It wasn't there. Thinking it had finished me off, I assumed it had left the area. And then a few strokes toward the bank until I felt the sandy bottom, and then I walked out of the water, frantically looking everywhere for my attacker, and still nothing came for me. What now? I thought. I had a long walk back home. I would freeze in this weather, but that was my only option. Before heading back up the bluff to my trail home, I looked for my gun and flashlight. And a few feet into the pile of discarded construction material, I saw the light I had dropped, and not far from the light, I saw my pistol laying in the leaves. And then I started straight up through the debris, working my way through the maze of pipes, trying not to break a leg. An injury now would be a death sentence. When I was clear of the pipes and up the bank a bit, I looked back over the area, and I saw the creature walking away from me in knee-deep water. The splashing had drawn my attention, and in the moonlight I could finally see its full form. Long legs stepped high in the water, and they carried a frame that no man could contend with in a fight. I expected it to return to the bank and head up the mountain where the bank leveled out, but instead it walked out deeper into the water and disappeared. The swirling of the slow current was all I could see on the surface. Patton Island was out there. Maybe that's where it was headed. The monster had come in and out of my life in a maddening, violent way, and I would never see it again. That moment was perhaps one of the most profound epiphanies of my life. For years, I had dreamed of becoming the monster that brought vengeance to my tormentors. And now, watching this magnificent creature walk away from me, I knew I was not, nor did I want to inflict the same terror on anyone as I had just experienced. I had just gone through something that few survive. It wasn't the size and vicious nature of the creature in that moment that brought on my epiphany. It was the image in my mind, still fresh as if I saw it an hour ago, of Seth's limp body hanging from the left hand of the beast. Seth's arm dangled free, and his fingers dipping into the surface, pushing a tiny wake. The beast had found its meal, and Seth the rapist vanished forever. I started for home, a changed man, wondering if I could make it back alive. On the side of the mountain, already feeling weak, I saw lights moving through the woods toward me. I stopped and yelled, and soon I was surrounded by searchers. Once they were sure that I wasn't Seth, they bundled me up and helped me get home. They all left after depositing me in the house except one deputy who stayed to make sure that I was not in serious hypothermia. After taking a hot shower and getting some microwave food in me, he and I sat at my table sipping coffee. And I explained that I had suspected Seth would be sheltering in those pipes since it was the only place he could have escaped the snow and wind. And then I lied and said that my plan was to hold him there until the searchers arrived. There was no need to say that I had planned to kill the guy for making fun of me. If by some strange event the creature didn't eat Seth that night and his corpse was found floating in the river, I might be implicated and questioned. I had fallen in the river like an idiot on the coldest night of January is what I told him, and then I headed straight for home, hoping to not freeze to death, and thank goodness that I had run into them. Not long after, and sure that I was healthy, the deputy left. Now, alone with my thoughts, all the repetitive visions I conjured every day over the years seemed to slip away. I wasn't a blooming serial killer after all. I felt sane for the first time since I was a kid. I slept well that night and woke the next morning to the news I already knew, that Seth the rapist had not been captured, but the search continued. And then, without hesitation, I walked out the door into the world with no fear, no anxiety. After finishing my paper route, I stopped at a local diner and ate a hearty breakfast, and I began to think of all the places I was now free to go. The monster was actually in the woods, not outside my door. Now I was free. A couple of weeks ago, you did a phone interview with a Colorado big game outfitter that has gotten me curious about this exact area, and I'll explain why. He mentioned he was in southwest Colorado, and for the past several years, myself and several friends from here and around the country meet up and elk hunt in the San Juan Mountains in southwest Colorado. We are in the area near the town of Dolores, a little more specifically, out in the mountains above Groundhog Reservoir. Back in 2018, I was hunting on top of a mountain called Black Mesa. The snow was knee to mid-thigh deep on me, and I'm 6 foot tall, and as I came up over a small ridge into a larger clearing, my path took me through what I came to see as a track of large prints. At first, I didn't really think much of it, as they were obviously a day or two old and the weather and fresh snowfall had made some effect on them. The more I looked at them, the more intrigued I became. While the weather may have eroded them, they were still almost double the size of my size 12 boot. There were no drag marks between the steps. They were post-holed across the clearing, with what was clearly a bipedal left-right gait. What made me think more about it was the stride, which was 4 to 5 feet between each step. There is no way somebody my size could replicate that. And even more amazing was the fact that the trackway never broke its stride. It came up out of the woods, across the clearing, and back down into the woods with a total distance of 100 yards, and that was what I could see. I took a few photos, which I'm embarrassed to say are of mediocre quality at best. Being more focused on looking for elk, I took a short break and then continued on my way. I mentioned the tracks to the other guys without much response. Nobody in our group saw anything out of the ordinary for the rest of the trip. In 2019, in the same area, myself and another guy had a couple of unexplained events on separate nights. This time, we were camped near the side of Black Mesa. On our second night in camp, I was awakened by a rhythmic knocking of wood on wood. 2 knocks, wait 10 seconds and then 2 more, wait a few more seconds and then 2 more. This went on for a couple of minutes and it seemed to be fairly close. At one point, after the 2 knocks, there was an additional knock that sounded much farther away, and at that point, the double knock started to move away, still knocking at 10-second intervals until I couldn't hear them any longer. I was the only person that heard those knocks that night, and again, I failed to investigate it. Being that it was in the middle of the night, and it was 25 degrees outside, I rolled over and I went back to sleep. I mentioned it to the group the next morning, but nobody heard anything. The third night, another member of our group heard the same knocks, but he too didn't get up to explore. The area behind our camp was heavy, dark timber, heading downhill toward a draw with a creek at the bottom. I put out a couple of game cameras, but didn't capture anything. Those were the only 2 occurrences we had last year. These 2 incidents made me curious if the outfitter you interviewed was in that same area. That entire area is surrounded by cattle ranches and guided hunt land. I've been interested in the subject of Bigfoot for a long time, although a lot of things I've seen on the internet I've been fairly skeptical of. These 2 events have piqued my interest into digging a little deeper. When my father was young, his grandfather took him to work on his day off so that the boy could see what he did for a living. He worked in the logging industry near Eureka, California. They arrived not long after daylight, and they walked on a newly cut logging road. The road was soft and dusty. My father was overwhelmed by the size of the trees and the vastness of the place where his grandfather worked. As they walked, they approached the dozer that had cut the road in the day before. Again, my father was amazed at the piece of equipment that could be this big. His grandfather noticed tracks in the dusty road. They exited the forest, made a circle around the dozer, and went back into the forest. My father was young then, so by the time he told us the story, he could only remember vaguely what he saw. He remembered vividly that the tracks looked human and that the person who left them wore no shoes. But the tracks were too big to be human, and he also remembered his grandfather saying that someone left these tracks as a joke. They weren't real tracks. A local newspaper did a story on it. We later researched the story but couldn't find the story archived in the library nor on the internet. When we would question my father about the incident, he would become agitated and he would change the subject. Years later, he was with a group in California hunting black-tailed deer. They camped and hunted for several days. Sometime after dark, when the fire was low, they were startled by the sounds of monkey-type screams coming from all directions around the camp. They stoked the fire to add more light to the area, but they saw nothing. The next day, they packed up and left. When I was 8, we lived a few miles west of Weaverville in a place called Slaughtery Pond. The mobile home was situated way back off the pond, and behind the house was nothing but wilderness. The landlord told us that black bears would sometimes venture into the area and cause trouble, and that we should be cautious. While we lived there, we heard screams coming from those woods that sounded like a woman being assaulted. My mother's eyes would water up and tell my dad that a woman needed help. Dad blamed the sounds on foxes or big cats, but we all knew the screams were too loud for those critters. My 15-year-old brother came running in the house excitedly one day, telling my mom about a series of man-like tracks that he found while exploring. His face showed fear, and he wouldn't accept our mother's explanation that it was a bear stepping in its own tracks. He said the tracks were too far apart, and they looked like it walked on 2 legs. He also motioned with his hands how large each track was. His hands were 18 inches apart. About a month later, I laid in bed awake next to my brother. We had a batch of kittens that stayed in our room. While laying there playing with a kitten, I noticed some kittens in the window still looking outward. All of them were in the typical Halloween cat arched back posture, their heads moving together, watching something outside. Footsteps came towards the house, and I could feel the bed vibrate with each step. The whole house shuddered, and I heard a cracking sound come from across the hallway. I slinked out of bed and walked to the door and slowly turned the doorknob. The knob made a slight click, and I heard this thing run away. I assumed it was gone. I ran to my parents' room, and I woke them, explaining what I had heard. My mother said it was cats fighting outside, but I knew better. I returned to my room, and I went to sleep. The next day at school, my brother asked if I remembered what happened last night. How could I have forgotten that, I said. He then told me to wait until we got home, that he had something really cool to show us. That evening, he led the whole family around to the backside of the trailer, all 8 of us, our parents and 6 kids. There was an exit on the rear of the trailer that had been covered with plywood. Inside the door was my mother's pantry. The trailer sat on sloping ground, and we stood on the low side. The threshold of the door was 2 or 3 feet above my head. There were no stairs. At the top of the plywood, there were claw marks made by some animal. The plywood was caved inward and almost broken. The noise I heard the night before was not cats fighting. Something tried to break into the house while we slept. We moved from there to some property that we bought near Trinity Lake. I was 10 years old at this time. We were way out in the country, and our closest neighbors were friendly, but they were a little different. They used to tell us how they fed a family of Sasquatch off their deck every night. They told us that there were 3 in this family, a male, a female, and a young Bigfoot. We acted like we believed them, but we really didn't. I slept in a hideaway bed in the living room with my younger brother. One night I woke up feeling like I had been choked and I could barely breathe. I again went into my mom and dad's room. Mom let me slip in with them, and they dozed back off. I lay there trying to get back to sleep, lying on my back with my eyes closed. Through my eyelids, I could see light flickers, like sitting in front of a campfire at night with your eyes closed. I thought I was imagining this or there was an easy explanation, but when I opened my eyes, the room was already turning a reddish color, and I could see the source moving about through the house. I could see the light through the walls as it seemed to go from room to room. And when I sat up to see better, a red ball of light came through the wall at the top of the door. It stopped halfway into the room, and it went still. It made no sound, it had no odor, and the ball looked like lava or plasma. It was a perfect sphere moving and rolling. It was the size of a basketball with a purple aura that was about 4 feet in diameter. White sparkles shot from the edge of the red and into the purple. It reminded me of fireworks that I had seen before, but there was no fire. It was actually beautiful. I could see clearly because of the light, so I put my hand on my mom's hip and I said, "Mom, look at that red light," and I pointed at it with my right hand. I looked back at the ball and it was just sitting there, so I again said, "Mom, look at the red light." She raised her head slightly, and I heard her voice tell me, "You're dreaming, son. Go back to sleep." But her mouth never moved. I don't think she's the one who said those words. I turned to look at the light again, and I think I blacked out. I was not in my mother's bed now. I was waking up, like from an anesthetic after surgery. When I could focus on my surroundings, I was looking out of a glass ceiling. The area was clear, and millions of stars filled my frame of view. Someone was holding my hand. I assumed it was my mother, and I looked for her. My hand, however, rested in the hand of a creature. It was a huge black hand covered in hair, and it was tipped by long, sharp black nails. Next to this huge creature was another just like it, but much bigger. I could see the whites of their eyes, and they both had surprised expressions. Another, even larger creature appeared in my view, and I decided then that this was a family. It was a father, a mother, and a child. They all looked like your classic image of Sasquatch. I felt like I was fully awake now, and I scanned the area. Standing against the wall facing us only a few feet away were 2 beings that I can only describe as aliens. They were both very tall. One had the appearance of a praying mantis in the face, a bony head with large black eyes that wrapped around to the side. Its head moved back and forth as it watched something on the other side of me. The other being was about the same size. Its skin was light blue, and its eyes had a copper sheen to them, as if it was wearing reflector sunglasses, but it wasn't. On the other side of me was a smaller alien that was gray in color. It bobbled its head at the others like it was talking to them, but I never heard it speak. At some point, everything faded back to black, and I must have fallen asleep again. And when I woke, I again felt as if I was waking from an anesthetic. Keeping my balance was a problem, but I stumbled down the hall and I saw that I was in our kitchen. In my ear, I heard a voice tell me to drink pickle juice. I hated pickles and pickle juice, and I still do, but I went straight to the refrigerator and I drank every drop left in a small jar and set the jar back on the shelf. A few minutes later, I felt normal again. The sun was coming up over the horizon. I have reflected on this event for years, and I never felt fear while I was under their control. There were no painful tests done on me that I remember. After I was returned, there were no wounds on my body. I don't remember much else than what I described above, but I did have a sense of a few things. It seemed as though the Sasquatch in the room were not there by their free will. They seemed to be captive, but I could be wrong. Last, whatever room I was in felt like an enclosed vessel or a spaceship. I think it was made from glass, but that is just what it looked like to me. The walls could have been translucent. There were no doors or evidence that I could see of an exit, and I do not know if we were moving. I did not get any sense of motion while I was in there. Many years later now, and I find it of great interest that our neighbors talked about the three Sasquatch they claimed to be feeding. Not much later, I am abducted, and on the spaceship are the same family of Sasquatch. Again, I think they were abducted with me. Also of interest is that the famous Patterson-Gimlin film that was shot in 1967 was taken not far from this location. Hundreds of Bigfoot sightings have been reported in the area. But after this event, my childhood was normal, and I've adjusted to these experiences. My story started many years ago in northern Minnesota. Being a hardened Minnesotan, I don't know how to say that. Minnesotan is one of my attributes that I wear proudly. Growing up in the harsh North Woods, I often think of the encounters I experienced as a young man growing up. However, not until the last 5 or so years did I realize what I encountered. I met my wife 35 years ago, and I married her. In all those years, I let her know of my strange, yet unverified, happenings in the woods. She would say, just lay off the bourbon. It wasn't uncommon for me to take my leave of her and venture out into the deep woods for quite some time. Camping is my passion, and I did it often. Moving to Wisconsin in 1990, we started our family, and I've been blessed with a son and a daughter, and are very close to me and my wife. Both my kids are avid outdoors people, and we get to experience nature as it was meant to be. After careful consideration, I've decided to share my most recent experience that makes me think that these creatures of the forest are not only here, but mean us no harm. I'll begin by saying that my thoughts on Bigfoot are met with hardcore evidence that they truly are real. My son and I are active and hardcore hunters. That being said, we often abandon all other activities when hunting season is open. Last spring, 2019, my son and I were camping on private land in western Wisconsin. The landowner lets us do whatever we want in exchange for chores that need to be done on the property. Prior to my last encounter, may I say that not only has my son and my daughter, and yes, my wife, have not only seen our hairy creature, but have come to enjoy the gifting process that we have started with them. Hunting this property, we have experienced and become somewhat comfortable with the sightings and gifting of our hairy friends. I am blessed that my daughter, wife, and son have gotten to experience what I have. At first, we were terrified of what we saw and experienced, but over time, though, we realized that they mean us no harm, as long as we respect their space. It was May of last year, and my son and I were turkey hunting on a spring hunt. We set up camp in what we call the Bottoms. It's 300 acres of woods, and it's our playground, and wild game is plentiful. The landowner dropped by with his wife, and we drank and relaxed by a fire deep into the evening. We already had 3 days of camping under our belts and had some interesting things happen. It was Friday afternoon and we saw turkeys, but none were close enough to harvest. We headed back to camp and the landowner showed up and brought bourbon and chicken quarters for the open fire. Strumming my guitar and feasting on campfire chicken and having a relaxing evening, they left around 10:30 and drove back to Madison. My son and I stayed up drinking and singing to my guitar when I noticed something strange in the darkness. Just out of the light of the fire, one could make out an outline of two beings in the distance. I reached over and tapped my son, and I pointed in the direction of what I was seeing. "Holy shit, Dad, there they are." "Yep," I said. "Are you scared?" "No," he said. "I think they're like playing, if that's possible," as he laughed. Well, around midnight, we decided that it was time for bed, so we retired to the tent. Getting up to go hunting at 4:30 would come pretty quick. Before going to bed, I went to potty behind the tent, and the creatures were gone, so I climbed into my sleeping bag, and it was a wonderful end to the day. One of the many nights my son and I have camped in these woods, it became obvious that we had company. It was only after many nights that we realized that our forest friends would always let us know that they were there. It was spooky and comforting at the same time, and let me say that after getting used to it, we slept pretty well. Prior to retiring, we stoked the fire with wood, so we had a fire in the morning, and I naturally wake up early, and even though we stayed up late, I would be up at my normal time of 3:30 or so making coffee and breakfast. But I didn't that morning. I was perhaps really tired as I slept until 5 a.m., but it wasn't me that woke up. Something outside the tent pushed me out of my cot. The push was powerful and firm, and I sprang awake and I reached over to my son, and he was there, and I said, "Get up, man, it's late," and I ran out to see if I could see who or what had pushed me out of my bed. My son said, "Dad, what's got you all wound up?" And I told him what had just happened. Well, he laughed and he said, "Well, they probably know what our schedule is and they woke you up." I took comfort in that as it made sense. I went on to make coffee, and being late as turkeys were already out of their roost, we ate breakfast and decided to say screw it and just hang out at camp. But what happened next is something that I will always remember. We were planning on camping another 2 days, so we were running low on eggs and bacon, and so we jumped in my truck and we drove the 10 miles into town to get what we needed. We got back to camp around 9:30 a.m., and what we saw was simply amazing. There was a huge tom laying next to the table where the camp stove was, and its neck was broken. "Well, I'll be damned, he gifted us a turkey," I said. "How freaking cool is that?" Our excitement was overwhelming, and we shouted thank you out into the woods. And even though it was now 10 a.m., we both took a shot of wild turkey, still in disbelief, and decided to gift them with some eggs and bacon. I cooked up a batch and put it on a paper plate and walked over to our gifting site, and I left it there. Shortly thereafter, we heard a whoop, and it was loud and close, and I smiled and I said, "Well, it's safe to say they got our gift." And I walked over to the gifting site, about 300 yards away, and the plate was gone, and in its place was a shiny, speckled rock. It's not the first time that we've been gifted rocks, and for whatever reason, they seem to gift back with rocks. Well, that's our story. Yes, I know some of you will find it unbelievable, but everything I've said is true. I know for sure if people would put down their phones and reconnect with nature, one never knows what may happen. This story happened somewhere in Mexico in the 1970s. It was told to me by my brother-in-law. I've never spoken with his friend about it, but as crazy as it is, I believe it's true. Since he wouldn't like it if I revealed his name, I would prefer that we all remain anonymous. My brother-in-law and his best friend were down in Mexico deer hunting. His friend hired some guides because they didn't know the area. In the 1970s, the drug cartel was all over the place, so they were warned if they had to hide to do exactly as they were told. Understandably, they were more than just a little nervous. They arrived where they planned to camp near the opening of the cave. They had their pack animals and supplies, and they were heavily armed, both for hunting and for protection. The next morning, when they went out to hunt, my brother-in-law was struggling to deal with his fear of being arrested in Mexico. So when the guides found them places to set up, he insisted that he be close to his friend. That first day, they hunted the whole day and saw a couple of deer. His friend told him to calm down, that it was only the first day. Calming down was not easy for them because the guides did not come back to get them. They had some beef jerky and some water with them, and they set up the best camp that they could, but it was a long night. The next morning, before daylight, one of the guides found them and told them that the other guides had left with the animals. He didn't know if they'd be coming back. At daybreak, the three headed out to try to find their way to the vehicles. At some point, my brother-in-law's friend was overcome by his fear and he panicked. He ran off. My brother-in-law tried, but there was no stopping him. Now it was just my brother-in-law and one guide. They managed to find where they'd left the vehicles, but my brother-in-law couldn't leave without his friend. The guide went back to look for him, leaving my brother-in-law in the vehicle to wait. They were parked close to the border, so that was the only small comfort. My brother-in-law waited for the rest of the day. The sun set, and he fell asleep while he was waiting. When he woke up, he found himself surrounded by Mexican nationals, none of whom spoke English. My brother-in-law didn't speak Spanish, but somehow they managed to convey to him that he needed to leave or he would die. So he left. With no other choice, my brother-in-law crossed the border and confessed everything to the Border Patrol. They were not happy with him, but at least now there would be others looking for his friend. My brother-in-law was sent to a town to wait for the news of his friend. After 3 days, the Border Patrol still hadn't found him, so they sent my brother-in-law home and said they'd send news if they found him there. However, they warned him that they didn't expect to find his friend alive at this point. My brother-in-law returned to his Texas town to face his friend's wife with the news. For 2 weeks, he did his best to keep her calm and try to prevent her from panicking. And then the news came. His friend was found by the highway patrol, lying on a highway in Texas, and he was alive. My brother-in-law went to see him in the hospital, but his friend wouldn't speak. He was dazed and confused. Even after they got him home, he wasn't talking. Physically, he was fine. He was just in a deep state of shock. Weeks went by with my brother-in-law making regular visits, and still he wouldn't speak. Eventually he began to come around, and finally he was able to tell this story. In his panic, he had gotten lost. He went down to the river bottom to hide among the boulders at the base of the cliffs. He was sure he was being hunted by the cartel and that death was imminent. He happened on a cave and he went inside to hide. And there, a big, hairy man found him. This creature, for the lack of a better word, brought him raw meat and berries to eat. He still had some jerky, so he passed on the meat. There was a female who brought him water as well. And it was days before he felt strong enough to leave them. When the time came, they were at the mouth of the cave, and he did his best to communicate goodbye to them. Once he was able to make them understand that he had to go, the female took him to the river where he filled his water pouch. Again he said goodbye, and she didn't try to stop him. He stuck to the riverbanks, knowing he'd have to hide every now and then to keep from being caught by the cartel. My brother-in-law said it was weeks before he could get the whole story out of him. No one talks about the time his friend got lost trying to hunt deer in Mexico. When my brother-in-law's friend first started telling his story, he left out the part of the Bigfoot. It was only when he had gone to a deer lease in South Texas that his friend finally confessed the whole story. Even then, my brother-in-law accused him of lying. This guy has made a full recovery now, but it was years before he could even go hunting again. I've never spoken with him directly to confirm or deny any of these details. This is only how my brother-in-law told the story. There was a road we used to drive into the brackish swamp in eastern Harris County, east of Houston, Texas. And in the daylight, it wasn't the least bit scary. In fact, it was beautiful. Oak trees draped in Spanish moss and tall grass and flowers were everywhere we looked. But at night, it was a different story. Those big oak trees closed in and turned the world to pitch. As the saying goes, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. We liked to find people who had never been on that road and then take them down it at night. There was a steep drop, and just before we'd get to the bottom, we'd turn off the headlights and scare the hell out of them. We did it many times, never failing to scare the living crap out of teenage girls, and never once having a problem. One night, my friend Charles decided to take our friend Jesse down there and scare him. Charles was a few years older than me. He'd gone to school with my brother, but when they graduated, my brother joined the Navy. Back then, volunteering for the military meant you had a choice. If you waited to be drafted, you were usually sent straight to Vietnam. Well, that night, we were in Charles's truck and heading down the road. It was a 2-lane blacktop called Wallaceville Road that no one lived on. Charles was driving his F-100 at 55 miles an hour, and Jesse was already a little freaked out by the speed we were going on that road. And right at the drop, Charles cut the lights, and Jesse started screaming for him to turn them back on. I was laughing inside and doing my best not to do so out loud. And then Charles turned the lights back on, and boom, we hit something. It happened so fast that we never saw what it was. It was just a blur. Charles slammed on the brakes, and whatever it was went up into the hood and over the top of the truck. And we sat there for a minute staring at the road, and we were all pretty shaken up. "What did we hit?" Jesse asked. His voice was trembling. We were all looking at each other, but no one answered. Finally, Charles opened his door and he got out. I exited the passenger side, but Jesse stayed in the truck. We walked to the front to survey the damage. There was a big dent in the bumper, and there was blood and hair. And scratch marks traced a path across the hood along with more hair and blood. I could feel the silence closing in on us. And at first, I didn't know if it was my own shock or if everything had actually gone quiet. I focused on the only sound I could hear. That was the truck's engine running. Charles pulled a flashlight out from behind his seat and walked to the back of the truck and then further up the road a few yards. He didn't see anything, so we got back in and we backed up to where we thought we'd hit whatever this was. Charles positioned the truck to angle the headlights into the woods. We still didn't see anything, so we got out. But not Jesse, though. He wouldn't get out. He begged us not to either. We could still hear Jesse as we walked down what looked like a narrow path. We'd made it 15 yards past the reach of the headlight when the horn started honking repeatedly. With a quick glance at each other, we took off at a dead run back up to the truck. Jesse was inside and he was covered in sweat and shaking uncontrollably with all the windows rolled up. I grabbed the door handle, but it was locked. Charles found the door was locked too. We pounded on the windows and we demanded that Jesse let us in, but he wouldn't, or he couldn't, respond. It was several minutes before he regained control of his senses and unlocked the doors. We tried to get him to tell us what happened, but he just sat there shaking and sweating. We decided it was better to get out of there, so we left as fast as we could. We drove back toward the highway and lights, but Jesse never uttered a word. We dropped him at his house on North Shore, but again, he never spoke. He climbed out of the truck and he walked slowly to the front door with his arms down at his side like some sort of funeral march. We watched him go inside before heading to my house, where Charles dropped me off. I didn't go in right away. I sat outside and thought over what had happened, and a million questions were going through my mind. What had we hit? And what did Jesse see that shook him up so badly? And why wouldn't he talk to us? The next morning, I called Jesse, but he still wasn't talking. I had to walk the 2 miles to Charles' apartment because he didn't have a phone. His truck was sitting out front, and I stopped to look it over. There were 3 deep scratches about 1 inch apart and 5 inches long on the hood. Well, I knocked on the door, and Charles came out to look at the damage with me. We decided to go over to Jesse's and talk to him, but his mother met us at the door, and she was furious. "What did you do to Jesse last night?" she demanded. He wouldn't tell her. He wouldn't tell anybody. He wouldn't even come out of his room. I was 13 when that happened. Jesse was 16 and Charles was 18. It was almost 2 years before Jesse spoke to me again. And when he finally did, all I ever got out of him was that something came out of the woods after Charles and I went down the path. It started shaking the truck, he said. And he closed his eyes and he couldn't bring himself to open them again. He blindly groped for the horn, and when he found it, he just kept honking it, and then the shaking stopped when we came back. That was the first time something weird ever happened to me. There was a second incident that happened 4 years later while I was fishing near the San Jacinto River in East Harris County, Texas, but I won't tell you that story now. I lost touch with those boys over the years, and I wonder if either of them is still around. I'm 62 years old now, and this is the first time I've spoken about this. Maybe I blocked it out somehow.